products, and these are kind of the accessory products. We have a full line of POE products, which is Power over Ethernet. We'll just go through these. One of the things that we use in our UPS Pro systems is this battery charging controller. It's a 5-amp controller. This is unique to us, but nobody else in the world has a system such as this. It's got dual inputs, so it's got an input for a solar panel here. It's got an input for POE here. So it can take a POE input from a power supply and POE inserter and use that to charge the batteries, or it can use the solar panel to charge the batteries, or both. When both are connected, if the solar panel is outputting power, then the POE power is not being used. So the solar power takes precedence. So you can reduce your electricity bill, which isn't very much anyway, but you can reduce your electricity bill by having a dual input charger like this. This charger has a built-in DC to DC converter, so this POE output here, it has a selection. You buy different controllers, but we have a 12-volt output, 18-volt, 24-volt, and 48-volt DC output. So that would be the POE output right here, the top connector. There's also, you can't see it, but on the back, there's an auxiliary output, which is a wire terminal output, just similar to the solar input or the battery input, but it's a wire terminal output, and that would be basically the battery voltage. So say you buy a TPSC POE-1248, that's a 48-volt POE output on the POE output, and on the battery, the auxiliary output, it would be 12 volts. So somebody can use this to power a camera through the auxiliary output at 12 volts, and an AP through the POE output at 48 volts. And they can power those two systems out of this one controller because it provides two different voltages. It's a standard POE output, so it's not 802.3 AF, but it conforms to the plus power on the unused pins 4, 5, and minus on the unused pins 7, 8 of the Cat5 Ethernet cable. This is a 5-amp maximum controller. We're changing the design of this controller to be 8 amps so we can handle larger solar panels. Right now the 5-amp can handle up to 85-watt panel. So we're changing it to an 8-amp, which can handle a 120-watt panel. So the other thing I should mention, that these systems have a very low operating current. So in the power budget for the outdoor UPS, they're a very small part of the power budget, which is important for a remote power system. This is kind of the typical application that I was just mentioning. We have a battery or a bank of batteries connected to the battery plus input. You have a solar panel or an array of solar panels connected to solar plus input. You have a camera connected to the 12-volt output, and you have an AP connected at 24 or 48 volts, whichever voltage your AP needs out of the POE output. The batteries are charged through the solar or through the power supply, which is supplying power over Ethernet into the input of the controller. These are some of the DC to DC converters we have. They're DC to DC converter POE inserters. So we have, this is the data input. There's a wire terminal that has two separate inputs for two batteries or maybe a primary and a secondary power source. The input can be from 9 to 36 volts on the input, and the output, which is out here, there's an RJ45 connector on the other side that is the POE output. It can be 18 volts, 24 volts, or 48 volts output. So from a 9 to 36 volt input, you can have 18, 24, or 48 volts output. The output power is up to 24 watts. So 24 volts, about 2 amps. I mean 1 amp. 48 volts, half amp. 18 volts, 1 1/4 amps, something like that. We have two different varieties. We have a plastic enclosure variety, and we have a metal, which we call our industrial version. We've had some customers, a military customer that wanted the metal enclosures because they're putting these in a vehicle application where they input 12 volts into the input connector, and then they have a POE, a data input, and they have a POE output at 48 volts to power their equipment in a mobile vehicle application. The other thing that these can be used for is if you have a 24-volt system and the voltage, say your voltage at say you have a 24-volt battery system with a solar panel. That voltage can range up to 28 volts when the batteries are charging through the solar panel. So, but your electronics can only handle 24 volts, maybe plus or minus 5%. And so what you can use one of these DC to DC converters to do is regulate that voltage. So you can hook the input to your 24-volt battery system, which can go between, 20 and 28 volts, something like that. And then the output would be a regulated 24 volts using one of these DC to DC converters. So that's another application that people are using them for. Typical application, I think I explained that already. So another DC to DC converter we have is an 802.3AF compliant. So the output will does the handshake with the client and will only power up if it sees a valid typical app valid mean 20 that already mean 20 DC mean 20 is an 802.3A mean 20 client mean 20 output volts out handshake volts out client volts out power volts out if it sees the volts out typical app volts out that already volts out C output C output DC C output is an C output 3A C output client C output C output handshake C output client A power A if it sees a typical app A that already A DC is an 3A client output handshake client power if it sees a typical app that already DC is an 3A client output handshake client power if it sees a typical app that already POE DC POE is an POE 3A POE client POE output POE handshake client to power else if it sees a has typical app a system which is this that already to else has a system DC we have a P3A which is client internet output handshake of the client through these power. One of the if it sees using our typical Vexnism that already Vexnism the DC Vexnism is an Vexnism 3A client output handshake client power if it sees a typical app that already the DC converter is an 3A client output handshake client power if it sees a typical app that already the DC converter is an 3A client output handshake client power typical app that already the DC 3A output handshake power typical app that already the DC 3A output handshake power typical app that already the DC converter is an 3A client output handshake client power if it sees a typical app that already.
No,
the DC converter is an 3A client. The output handshake client power if it sees the typical application. That already. No, the DC converter